Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to the third and final part of the Fulgrim book lore breakdown. I won't torture you for too long and get right into the conversation Ferris, Manus, and Fulgrim had together. Last part, we learned that Horus had sent Fulgrim to try and convince Ferris Manus, one of the most tight-assed people in the entire Imperium, to turn traitor. A frankly baffling idea, but here we are. As far as Ferris Manus was concerned, he was a little bit confused as to why his brother was coming to him so soon, but he figured that maybe, just maybe, Fulgrim wanted to come and make amends for what had happened to their relationship after the battle against the Diasporex, where the two had parted rather hastily, to put it mildly, and not on the best of terms. Something that greatly confused Ferris, considering he had pulled Fulgrim's perfect little ass from the fire, and suffered great damage to the Fist of Iron in doing so. I gotta say, this is an interesting look into Ferris Manus' psyche. It's surprisingly sympathetic and forgiving. I mean, I'd even go so far as to call it downright blue-eyed in its naivete. Okay, so after the battle against the Diasporex, the two had parted very hastily, with a very brief ceremony that saw them both part ways. Fulgrim had even insulted Manus and his legion by refusing to have the ceremony take place on the Fist of Iron, deeming that it was too battle-damaged for a ceremony of such gravitas. Which I'm, again, kind of surprised that Ferris Manus didn't ask him snidely, "Oh, really? Oh, how do you think it came to be so ravaged, brother?" But, hey. I mean, Ferris is actually really sympathetic here. He's like, okay, yeah, we've parted on bad ways, but maybe he's realized that, he's come to make amends, and I'm not going to hold it against him, I'm not going to hold a grudge, and don't you dare, Santor, mention anything about us saving him. I gotta say, this is far more of a human side of Ferris Manus than pretty much anything we've seen before, and while I still maintain that the plan to try and convince him to become a rebel is blatantly ridiculous, at least now I understand kind of why Fulgrim would have thought that maybe he could do it, because clearly Ferris is quite soft when it comes to Fulgrim. And speak of the lunatic, he had made some more plans. Clearly he was not quite as naive as Ferris. He clearly had a little bit of doubts himself as to his diplomatic abilities in being able to talk Ferris Manus, again of all bloody people, into rebellion. He decided then to let his fleet infiltrate the Iron Hands fleet. Nobody would really raise an eyebrow at it, it wouldn't be anything particularly strange. Maybe something a little out of the normal, that the Emperor's children would fly in so close a formation, and inside the Iron Hands formation, but nothing that would rouse too much in the way of suspicion. After all, the Emperor's children had just arrived. Maybe they were simply seeking refuge amongst the Iron Hands fleet until they themselves could organize properly and make plans for how they were going to deploy, whether or not they were going to be sticking around, or whether or not this was just a brief visit, etc. Nothing too out of the ordinary. Obviously, the actual intention was somewhat more violent. Just in case Ferris could not be convinced, then the relatively small Emperor's Children fleet would be able to, at the very least, prevent the Iron Hands from lashing back in any effective fashion. And all of that was probably a good idea, since apparently Fulgrim's been taking diplomatic advice from the Eldar. In his conversation with the Farseer did pretty much everything wrong. Well, he didn't notice the demon weapon for once, which was stupid enough, but essentially he laid out all of his, what he considered to be facts, in the most blunt and direct manner possible, delivering statement after statement that to the other party sounds utterly and completely ridiculous, and then expecting them to simply nod their heads and go along with it. It takes Fulgrim a grand total of, I think, 2 pages to have Ferris Manus go from "brother, huggy huggy welcome" to "I'm going to knock your head off with a hammer." Which really is quite an achievement. This is why they call Fulgrims Legion the most perfect of legions. He had one meeting with an Eldar Farseer, and he is already out-Eldaring the Eldar in the arts of diplomacy. So yeah, the whole talking the most tight-assed person in the entire Imperium into rebellion didn't really work out. I know, it came as a real shock to me too. and the two of them have a little bit of a fight, which Fulgrim wins relatively easily. Mostly because Ferris decides to incapacitate himself. Now, to be fair, he probably didn't know what was going to happen. He was, of course, fighting with the hammer, whilst Fulgrim was fighting with his sword, the one using the other's weapon. Fulgrim swung the sword at Ferris. Ferris caught the sword in his silver metallic hands and destroyed it, stating that he had made this sword and he could unmake it. The resulting explosion flung both of them across the room, but took an even greater toll on Ferris, who was in a great deal of pain after unmaking his sword. Now, again, I can understand that he probably hadn't done this before and didn't really understand the cost to him physically, but detonating your enemy's weapon while you are holding it inches in front of your face, it doesn't really sound like a winning strategy. And it had resulted in him being now entirely at his brother Fulgrim's mercy, who simply picked up the warhammer he had made beneath the Urals and wandered over to the recumbent form of Ferris, who did what any honourable idiot would do and spit up at him and go, "You'd best kill me or I'm gonna come after you." Is there anything worse you can say to somebody that's standing over you with a warhammer? I'm not entirely sure, but Fulgrim, interestingly enough, decided to not whack his brother's head off. Probably this was some last vestige of Fulgrim still fighting back against the insanity. He had not, after all, brought his silver sword, which, all in all, was probably a pretty damn good idea, because Ferris would have been able to break that thing far easier without incapacitating himself. Not to mention, Ferris probably wouldn't be quite as stupid as Eldred would, and probably would notice something wrong with the sword, considering Ferris literally is capable of making weapons with his bare hands. He'd probably notice something wrong with the Snake Orgy Temple weapon. And so, without its whispering voice in his ear, Fulgrim decided to spare his brother, though he wasn't quite as generous with his brother's servants, Santor included. Their respective honor guards, the Morlocks and the Phoenix Guard, were both standing outside the chamber in which the Primarchs had had their little scuffle. Once Fulgrim stepped out, he gave a signal. The Phoenix Guard stepped out of line and, with synchronized, smooth strikes, beheaded the Morlocks next to them. Next, he issued the order for the fleet to open fire. Full spread of torpedoes and broadside batteries at point-blank range. Now, the small fleet that accompanied the Emperor's Pride to this meeting, partially so as to not arouse any unwanted suspicion amongst the Iron Hands, was not particularly large, but it was perfectly placed within the Iron Hands fleet to deliver torpedoes and lance battery weapons at point-blank range to unshielded and unprepared Iron Hands ships. Now, the Iron Hands do build them very, very tough, but this was more than even they could stand up to. The fleet was effectively crippled within minutes, with very little effective return fire being levied against the Emperor's Children fleet. Fulgrim, however, still not having been reunited with his demon sword, could not bring himself to simply destroy the Iron Hands fleet right then and there, and ordered a halt to the attack before the fleet could be destroyed, and crucially, before the Fist of Iron could be fully destroyed. The damage done would undoubtedly have crippled any other fleet for years in all due likelihood, but again, these are the Iron Hands, and they build them very, very tough. Part of me wonders if Fulgrim simply thought he had crippled them and could just leave them be. Maybe he could avoid having to deal with Ferris himself. If he thought so, he vastly underestimated the sheer bloody-minded tenacity of the Iron Hands, as it would take only mere months before the fleet was ready, at least in part, to pursue their traitorous kin. Meanwhile, other events had stirred up the Immaterium, broiling storms covering pretty much all of it and making it virtually impassable. Eventually, it gave just enough of an opening for Dawn to inform his legions to gather and attack the War Master. At this point in time, of course, none of the Loyalists knew quite of the full extent of the treachery, and Ferris, taking the least damaged ships he could find, hurried off to face his errand brother. Partially due to the fact that Ferris is a very, very angry lad, and partially because he feared that maybe his brothers might find something questionable in his behavior. Perhaps others might think that if Fulgrim came to him, it must be because Fulgrim thought he could turn him, that Fulgrim had seen some weakness in Ferris that others had not. And it is a legitimate concern. I mean, again, the entire decision to send anybody to try and woo Ferris just seems baffling, so it stands to reason that somebody like Rogal with a stick up his ass might think, well, I never thought Ferris could possibly be tempted by anything like this, and yet Horus, who isn't a complete idiot, tried just that. There's gotta be something I'm not seeing here. Mostly, though, it's just because Ferris is a very, very emotional lad, and right now his primary emotion is anger. And that is such a destructive emotion, so much better if you move on to something more peaceful, like music. The Emperor's children are about to have a little bit of a concert. What could possibly go wrong? So, as I mentioned briefly, the Lair Temple was an interesting place. It had all kinds of wonderful lights and colours and drugs and sounds and all kinds of adorable things going on in rather excessive proportions. The Emperor's children had decided to try and recreate this because, again, what could possibly go wrong? Turns out that ripping a hole in reality and summoning demons is what could possibly go wrong. The Emperor's children managed, through music, quote-unquote music, and other horribleness, to create sounds so disturbing, they literally made people kill each other in sheer rage and passion and whatever else. Which is an achievement, if nothing else. I mean, it is a genuine achievement to create music that summons demons and make people kill each other. Also, this is where the Noise Marines were originally born. I actually really like this piece of backstory. It is just so utterly over the top that it is perfectly 40k. Basically, all of these musicians, now thoroughly corrupted by Slaanesh, had spent months, if not possibly even years, crafting these insane new instruments and all manners of amplifiers to boost their noise, I can't really call it music anymore, to such hilarious levels that they were capable of literally ripping a hole in the goddamn material world. As you can probably imagine, anything capable of doing something quite so insane would probably be a pretty decent weapon if you handed it to an Astartes, and that is exactly what happened. Now, clearly, these musical instruments are at this point not normal, to put it very bloody mildly. They must have been corrupted, probably due to the sounds they make. Now, of course, we've on multiple occasions heard that it is capable of breaching the veil between the material world and the Immaterium via certain incantations. And what are incantations? Except, of course, sounds with certain meanings to them. The meanings are, of course, imparted by the people saying them. In other words, if they believe this is a demonic chant, it will be a demonic chant. And of course, it isn't so simple as just simply going like, oh yeah, this is totally a demonic chant. You have to believe it from the bottom of your very soul. And in this case, these people had spent months convincing themselves that this noise was in some way divine, in some way linked to a godlike creature, that it couldn't possibly come from the human realm, that it was beyond basic humanity. They had imparted their noise with these attributes that now tore a hole in the material world and let demons flow through to massacre, well, the musicians and everybody else. This act then, in turn, imparted certain, shall we say perhaps even magical properties onto the instruments. They were no longer creating mere noise. Instead, they were a link directly between Slaaneshi's rather depraved realm and the real world. And as you can imagine, if you pointed something like that in the general direction of something fleshy, bad things were bound to happen. And the first time that these Noise Marines were to be used in combat was, of course, on Istvan V, where Fulgrim had been sent to fortify the planet against the coming Loyalists. something Fulgrim was not particularly happy with. He had imagined a far more glorious endeavor awaited him in the Istvan system, rather than simply being sent off to some planet to grub in the dirt and build fortifications. That most certainly was not a job for the Emperor's children. Maybe for Mortarian sullen bastards, perhaps, but not for the Emperor's children, surely. Horus, however, did know how to handle Fulgrim at this point, and played up his pride. He could only trust Fulgrim to truly make perfect fortifications and so on. And it's lucky that he did, because at this point Fulgrim had gone full batshit, and, as we've already noted, Horus had given him an anathema. So yeah, having an argument with Fulgrim right now would be a bad thing. Now, next up, of course, are the events of the Urgal Depression, the great slaughter of the Loyalist legions, the Battle of Istvan V. I will not be covering this here because, frankly, those are pretty major events and they deserve a video all of their own with custom art and everything. A proper little lore series will be made on the events in the Istvan system, don't you worry. When, I hear you ask? Well, something between now and the heat death of the universe. Probably. At least there's a good 50-50 chance, unless I get hit by a bus first, in which case, you're fucked. Sorry. Anyways, we will, however, talk a little bit about what happened on Istvan V between Ferris and Fulgrim. Ferris had actually been on the verge of retreating alongside the other Loyalist regions when their reinforcements arrived, but after having caught a glimpse of Fulgrim, he pushed himself and his Morlocks even deeper into the traitor lines, a somewhat bad idea. Granted, he had brought 10 full companies of Morlock Terminator elites with him, which is one hell of a sledgehammer, but it was still going to turn out to be a rather bad idea, where Ferris, and Fulgrim once again met in single combat. Ferris had recreated Fireblade, the weapon he had made under the Ural Mountains on Terra, and Fulgrim, of course, was wielding the Hammer Forgebreaker, the weapon he had created. Previously, Fireblade had proven to be the inferior weapon, or, well, it had proven to be the losing weapon anyways. This time around, however, all doubt was sundered. It was not the weapons, it was the wielder. Fulgrim was simply better than Ferris, or, well, he might not have been better than Ferris before. Now, however, with the full blessing of Slaanesh coursing through his vein, converting any pain into pleasure, he was considerably more powerful than Ferris. It also didn't exactly help that this was right about where the Great Betrayal also began, with all of the Loyalist reinforcements opening fire upon their supposed friends and gunning them down in their thousands. Watching that from a distance cannot exactly have done wonders for Ferris's, psyche. Hell, Fulgrim even offered that if Ferris threw down his weapon and surrendered right then and there, Fulgrim would plead his case to Horus. I'm honestly not entirely convinced that Horus would have listened, considering, well, again, Ferris wasn't exactly the most likable of people, nor the most pliable, but it was an offer I'm almost slightly surprised that Fulgrim would even make. Again, he knows what kind of a person Ferris is, and yet he seems to think he can talk him into treachery for some mysterious reason. I really can't quite understand why Fulgrim is doing this, because it is just such a complete antithesis to what Ferris is. I'm halfway tempted to think that maybe Fulgrim is trying to look for an out. Maybe he's trying to look for a way to assuage his guilt over what he has done. Maybe he's trying to save Ferris now in the 11th hour and somehow convince himself that this good act is enough to weigh up for the bad? I don't know. It just seems strange that he would continue pleading to Ferris when he knows damn well that Ferris is never going to change. And so they had their fight. To be fair, it was a relatively close-run thing. Fulgrim eventually winning due to his blessings, I suppose, and the intervention of his silvery blade. Otherwise, Ferris might very well have gutted him. Nevertheless, victory went to Fulgrim, who eventually slew his brother with the demon sword. It should be noted that, interestingly enough, Fulgrim had regained his senses at this point. In fact, he'd regained his senses a short while before, during the fight with Ferris. However, seeing what he had become and what his perfect legion had become, he didn't like it. Unsurprisingly, he even attempted suicide, and it's a little bit unclear, but it seems as if the sword might have stopped him from doing so. He pointed Fireblade at his chest, and the demon simply said, "Suicide is not for the likes of you," and he flung the sword away. It's a bit unclear, but I find it hard to believe that Fulgrim, again, fully understanding that this is a demon, would just go like, "Oh, well, demon in my head, you don't agree with me killing myself, so I guess I can't." Just seems a bit silly, but the demon is clearly at least still partially in control, so it flinging the blade away and going, "No, I'm not going to let you do that," would make more sense. The demon then offers up to Fulgrim the sweet release of nothingness. The demon can put Fulgrim out of his misery if only Fulgrim surrenders what is left of his mind to the demon, which Fulgrim does. Now, a couple of things here. So, Fulgrim throughout this has kind of appeared as if he is aware of the demon, but it seems now as if he's kind of been partially under the control of the demon the whole time as well, which kind of contradicts with the other parts where he's been able to leave behind the demon sword and even act relatively clearly previously. It's really confusing to try and figure out where the demonic entity ends and where Fulgrim begins. Again, I have a real problem with how easily Fulgrim was corrupted through all of this, and now he decides to surrender himself to the demon. Now that I don't have any problems with, because assuming Fulgrim now wakes up and sees all of the bad shit that has happened, he probably would want to just end it all, and if the demon offers him oblivion, well, one could say that that might be the last straw that a drowning man might grasp for. But of course, in doing so, Fulgrim ceased to be, as the demon took full control over his body and his mind. The demon even went so far as to torture Fulgrim just a little bit extra by not completely wiping out his essence, but rather trapping it within a painting, so that it could hang in La Phoenicia, where that creepy little concert took place, and forever it could then gaze out upon the destruction that had happened to his once proud legion. It is a good ending, in a way, but we'll talk about it in a little bit. But first, one more interesting tidbit. After the battle, the demon decides to reveal itself to Horus, which is an interesting choice. On one hand, it's certainly better for it to come out and show itself and be like, "Hey, I'm a demon, so, don't get panicky and kill me later on." But on the other hand, it is also damned risky, since Horus at this point is still not entirely happy with the idea of allying himself with literal demons. Not to mention, Horus still has some feelings of kinship for his brothers. When the demon presents him with the severed head of Ferrous, for example, Horus is appalled. He knew he'd have to kill his brethren, but to see it done, that was something else entirely. And here stands a demon inhabiting the flesh of one of his brothers. That is one hell of a risk for the demon to take, and I'm half surprised that Horus didn't pull a bolt pistol on it right then and there. Horus does, however, tell it that it had better make sure that nobody else realizes that it's a demon, otherwise he will destroy it. Horus's plan here is basically just to humor the thing, and hopefully he can rescue his brother through some arcane means further down the line, but for right now, he needs the Emperor's children on his side, and acting overtly against what they think is their Primarch might not be a particularly good idea either. We also get an interesting little tidbit that Horus receives a communique from Magnus the Red. This is after the burning of Prospero, a burning that Horus himself had ordered, the Emperor originally had just told Russ to bring Magnus to Terra, as we'd seen previously in this book, not attack Prospero. That order came from Horus. Undoubtedly, Magnus is starting to wonder what's going on in the galaxy, and while he hasn't turned fully yet, and will not for quite some time, clearly he's looking around for any kind of friend. Magnus. Genuinely tragic bastard that. He did what he thought was right, and he kept doing so until his entire legion was practically destroyed. You know what they say, the road to hell is indeed paved with good intentions. Now, right at the end, let's talk about the ending. So, I really liked this ending. The demon traps Fulgrim's spirit in a painting where he looks like the perfect, beautiful warrior he always wanted to be. Gleaming armor, a glowing sword, he looks like a hero out of ancient legend. He looks like the painting that Serena D'Angelos would have painted of him if she hadn't gone insane and painted him in feces and blood rather than actual paint. And the only thing that stands out from amongst the perfection is the figure's eyes, which somehow transmit a sense of distress and hopelessness. Fulgrim is literally trapped inside it, bound forever to watch his legion fall further and further into depravity to never again be saved. This is an excellent ending because it's open-ended. So many things could happen from this. Hell, it even opens the door for a possibility of a loyalist Fulgrim. Let's say that in 100,000 years, or actually that's a bit too much, since that would pass us way beyond 40k, but let's say that in 10,000 years, the pride of the Emperor, after having been crippled or something, pops out of the warp as part of a space hulk. This painting is rediscovered, and the people who see it is just like, wow, this is an amazing painting. What is it doing in this horrible place? And take it back, and through some diggity-bob bullshit nonsense, Fulgrim is reborn, but it's the proper Fulgrim, not the chaos-corrupted Fulgrim. That would be, oh god, so interesting. Imagine a fully gone traitor Primarch trying to, how shall I say, cozy up to the Empire, trying to prove himself, trying to prove that he isn't what he is thought of to be, and trying to once again rebuild the Emperor's children from the ashes of their destruction. That would be a truly interesting Phoenix from the Ashes tale. There is so much cool shit they could do with this. And hell, even just the fact that a demon is inhabiting Fulgrim's body opens up so many interesting possibilities for how his legion would respond to it, but sadly, and this is definitely a spoiler, but well, I am covering the series here, so now, as I mentioned, I'm not going to cover the smaller books, and this is one of those smaller books. This book, The Mirror Cracked, completely destroys all of this, and it's by the same author, which is what really annoys me. This was the perfect ending. It was poetic, and it had justice in it. It had horror, depravity, despair. It had a real gut punch to the reader, and it is all just completely destroyed with The Mirror Cracked. It turns out that Fulgrim, through some kind of bullshit magic and his mental faculties that wasn't there at any point when the demon was taking over his mind to begin with, had figured out some way to not only escape the painting, but take control back over his body and send the demon hurling off into the dark recesses of his mind. God damn, that is just the... That is, in my opinion, Death Note levels of bad endings right there. It took a really great idea and just fucked it all in return for being able to tell us that, oh no, this really is Fulgrim and Fulgrim is a bad guy. It's like, God. It is... surrounded by people with so much more interesting backstories, like Perturabo and Horus, Fulgrim just feels so weak. I mean, even Angron has a better backstory than Fulgrim, in my opinion, at this point. And that's really sad, because The end of Fulgrim was such a beautiful, perfect, and poetic ending, and I really do feel like they just completely ruined it. And I feel like I'm being way too hard on Graham McNeil here, because again, like I said, he writes some excellent books. I really love the Ultramarine series. Yeah, Uriel Ventures can be a little bit Mary Sue, and the whole, cool Smurfs don't follow the book thing is also definitely something I can put myself a little bit behind, but I have got nothing against him as a writer. I think he's made some great books, and for the most part, Fulgrim is a very solid book, but The Fall of Fulgrim, I feel, could have been so more, and The Mirror Cracked, I can't help but feel like it was a hugely missed opportunity to make something really unique and interesting with Fulgrim. Granted, the new Fulgrim, the far more sassy, traitorous, kinda malicious and serpent-like Fulgrim, is also a pretty damn good one, but compared to what could have been, I don't know. But, of course, that is all very much so my personal take on it, and I think this has gone far enough. This has been, 2 hours and 10 plus minutes now? Yeah, that's a pretty lengthy one, so I'll wrap it up with my conclusion on the book itself. I think it was decent, but I feel like it did a disservice to Fulgrim. Now, bear in mind, at this point in time, the Horus Heresy was not planned to be as long as it is today. I think it was planned to be maybe 12 books, so I can kind of get why they felt the need to kind of rush the development of Fulgrim, but I really feel like he was badly undercooked, and we never got a real sense of him falling. Instead, he kinda started out kinda corrupted and didn't really go anywhere with it. I mean, he sanctioned the experiment on his legionaries before he found the Lear sword. I really feel like we didn't get to see his fall from grace so much as we got to see the last 2 steps of his fall from grace. The Eldar scene also felt kinda pointless to me because it didn't really lead anywhere other than kinda showing us how bad the Eldar are at diplomacy once again. And the whole idea of trying to talk Ferris Manus into becoming a rebel also just strikes me as odd. You could kind of say it might be Fulgrim trying to save Ferrous, save him from having to be his enemy, but this really was the worst way to go about it, too. Just delivering the news flat-faced straight to Ferrous, just like, yeah, we're turning rebels. I know that is the thing you hate the most in the entire cosmos, but trust me, it'll be fine. It wasn't much of a convincing speech. And as I labored on at length, the ending, I feel, was a real fantastic ending that was completely just butt-fucked by the Mirror Cracked. Right then, the next book will be Book 6, Descent of Angels, a book I am half looking forward to, half dreading. The Dark Angel books are some of the worst books in the Horus Heresy series, and The Descent of Angels is, in my opinion, probably the first kinda not really good book. I hated it the first time I read it, but rereading it and really looking for hints and clues and pieces of information, it is a treasure trove of information about the Dark Angels, which is good, but the storytelling could have been better, most certainly. Until then, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.